All right, so in this video, I want to introduce the desert constraint. Just explain the harm principle. Now the other big limit is the desert constraint. Later, we'll come back to explore some of the details and the liberal case, the freedom-based case for the desert constraint and why it's necessary in a free society. But just to give you the basic idea, the desert constraint says, simply put, that conduct may be criminalized and punished only if and to the extent that this is deserved. So unless the conduct deserves punishment, criminalizing and punishing it would be unjust. It would be to punish basically the innocent. And that would not only be an unjust violation of the dignity of those who are convicted despite having done nothing that's really wrong, but it would also unfairly restrict the freedom of citizens who are convicted and punished without deserving it. So a free society that values individual dignity and freedom must respect the desert constraint. Okay, big question. What is desert? The first thing to notice is that desert, which I understand to be the same as culpability, it's not the same thing as causing harm. Harm can be caused through sheer accident with no fault on your part at all. Culpability, what makes you deserve punishment, instead is actions that manifest disrespect or a lack of concern for others, as when you intentionally attack someone or take crazy and unjustified risks of harming people for no good reason, like driving 120 on the highway just for your own amusement. When your actions are culpable in that sense, we think it makes punishment more deserved. And without any desert basis for punishing, if you're completely innocent, then criminalization and punishment would simply be unjust. Instead, desert means culpable wrongdoing or properly prohibited action that's culpable. For your action to be culpable means that it manifests insufficient concern or respect for others, right? Their rights or their interests. You're culpable when you do things that clearly show you didn't care enough about the safety, well-being, or property rights of others. Okay, so what does it mean to care enough, to have sufficient concern for others? This is understood in terms of what it's reasonable to expect or demand of someone in the circumstances. All of us as citizens who could, rightly or wrongly, find ourselves in the position of a potential defendant, we have a right to our own amount of reasonable freedom, which means the right to be free from overly burdensome, difficult, or impossible demands. So what counts as sufficient concern for others maps onto what can be reasonably be demanded of us, what meets a standard that is not unreasonably difficult or costly or impossible for the individual to live up to. For example, if your family's threatened unless you commit a crime, let's say theft or selling drugs for a gang, this could excuse you and reduce your culpability because it would be asking too much to expect anyone in similar circumstances to be able to let harm come to their family just so that they could avoid some criminality of this low-level kind. So similarly, if you suffer from mental illness, it makes it essentially impossible for you to understand what you're doing or conform your conduct to the law, then that's just your cognitive machinery malfunctioning. It doesn't necessarily show that you actually have insufficient regard or disrespect for others. So the proper response is not criminal conviction and punishment, but treatment, and perhaps being confined during that treatment to keep society safe until you're better. So in that way, criminalization and punishment has to be deserved, right? So for it to be deserved, your action has to conclusively show that you didn't care sufficiently or have a sufficient amount of respect for others or their rights, right? Your conduct has to show that you acted as you did because you didn't care enough about others for some less criticizable reason, like that your family was threatened or that you were mentally ill or that the risks you were taking were actually justified because they would bring about some recognizable good consequences. All those things would lower your culpability and make punishment less deserved. So that's the desert constraint in a nutshell. We'll dig more into what it means in detail down in a minute, but I just want to clarify one big thing again before going ahead. The desert constraint, as I explained it just now, is a limit on criminalization. It says don't criminalize unless and only to the extent that it's deserved based on the culpable wrongdoing of the defendant. For the defendant's violation of some reasonable demand of how they should have acted instead of doing the crime. Okay, but as with the harm principle, which says harmfulness is necessary for criminalization, while harmfulness is also a positive basis for supporting criminalization, the same kind of thing is true for desert, for culpability. We'll mostly be focused on desert as a limit on criminalization, right? So as a necessary condition for criminalizing your conduct. But it's important to bear in mind that many people, many scholars, and in fact, many portions of the criminal law buy into the idea that very serious wrongful conduct, very serious moral culpability, can also be a positive basis in favor of criminalization. Maybe it's not a sufficient condition by itself for criminalization, but it's at least a reason in favor of criminalization. So harm, as with the harm principle, harm can be a limit on criminalization as well as a positive reason that supports criminalization. And likewise for desert, the culpability of your conduct is a requirement for just criminalization, and it can also be a reason that helps support or strengthen the case for criminalizing and punishing your conduct. So that's the desert constraint is the limit, and the desert principle is the idea that culpability can provide some positive reason that supports criminalization as well. And with that introduction in place, I now want to dig into some more of the specifics about how the harm principle and the desert constraint are supposed to work. I want to ask whether they really can limit the criminal law so much in practice, right? Or if it turns out that anti-liberal legislatures might find ways to get around these liberal constraints on criminalization. We'll see.